Before we begin, take a quiet breath and settle into wherever you are right now. What you are about to hear is offered purely for reflection, for curiosity, and for the kind of inner exploration that doesn't always find space in the noise of daily life. This is not news. This is not prophecy. This is not a political statement or a personal judgment about any individual. This is a story about something far older and far more universal than any one person, any one election, or any single headline. Think of what follows as mythology dressed in modern clothes. An invitation to look at the human condition through a lens that is ancient, symbolic, and deeply psychological. The names and events you may recognize from the outside world are used here not as endpoints, but as doorways into something much larger. The story of power, of shadow, of the fall that precedes transformation, and of what it means when the mask a person has worn for decades finally begins to slip. Everything said here is meant to illuminate the inner life, not to condemn or celebrate any outer figure. If you are drawn to ideas about human nature, about the psychology of power, and about what ancient wisdom might say to modern collapse, then you have found the right place. There is a quiet kind of knowing that moves through the world like an underground river. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't hold press conferences or demand your attention. It simply flows, patient and persistent, beneath the surface of every story we tell ourselves about what matters. And every so often, something above the surface cracks. A headline, an event, a fall. And suddenly that underground river becomes visible. Suddenly the questions that people had been too distracted or too afraid to ask begin to rise, unbidden, into the light. This is one of those moments, not because of what any particular person has done or failed to do, but because of what this moment, like all great moments of public fracture, is actually showing us about ourselves. If you have ever found yourself sitting with an uncomfortable feeling when you watch the theater of modern politics, not just frustration, not just anger, but something deeper, something almost like grief, then this conversation is for you. If you've sensed that there is a lesson here that goes far beyond any one name, any one party, any one country, then stay with us. This channel exists for exactly that kind of wondering. And if you feel that something here resonates, consider walking with us for a while. There is much more to explore. Now let us begin where all great mythological stories begin, with a figure who carries more weight than any single human being was ever meant to carry. Every civilization in recorded history has produced what the psychologist Carl Jung called an inflation of the ego, a moment when an individual, usually one who has tasted great power or great fame, begins to identify not with their actual human self, but with something they imagine to be larger. They begin to see themselves not as one person among billions, each carrying their own wound and their own wisdom, but as a symbol, as a movement, as the embodiment of something eternal and chosen. The ancient Greeks called this hubris. The Egyptians encoded warnings about it in the very architecture of their tombs. The Norse spoke of it in the story of Baldur, the most beloved of gods, who was convinced by his own mythology of invincibility, until reality, in the form of a single sprig of mistletoe, found the one place he had never thought to protect. What makes these stories so enduring is not that they are about exceptional people. What makes them endure is that they are about a pattern, a universal, deeply human pattern, that any of us can fall into whenever we begin to believe that we are the story, rather than simply one of its characters. The mask becomes the face, the role becomes the self, and in that moment of confusion, something essential is always lost. When we look at the figure at the center of today's reflection, a man whose name has become one of the most polarizing words in the modern lexicon, we are not looking at a monster or a saint. We are looking at an archetype. We are looking at what happens when a human being, with all his wounds and defenses and desperate needs for validation, is placed at the center of a mythological narrative he did not fully understand, and could not ultimately control. We are looking at the story of a man who, in the words of the ancient texts, flew too close to the sun, and is now experiencing the long, slow, and very public descent that always follows such flights. The terrible news is not a single headline. The terrible news, from the perspective of the deep story, is something more structural than any legal verdict or political defeat. The terrible news is the nature of the fall itself, what it reveals, what it costs, and what it demands of those who witness it. To understand this fall, we have to go back to the beginning, not to the biographical beginning, not to the childhood, the schools, the family fortune, but to the psychological beginning, to the moment, somewhere in the interior landscape of a young person's life, when a decision is made. Sometimes the decision is made consciously, but more often it is made in the deep and wordless language of the body, of the nervous system, of the child who is trying to survive an environment that feels threatening or unstable or deeply conditional in its love. The decision is this: I will become someone who cannot be ignored. I will become so large, so loud, so visible, so powerful, that the thing I fear, irrelevance, smallness, the suffocating feeling of not mattering, can never reach me again. This is not an unusual decision. In fact, it is one of the most common psychological adaptations in human experience. Psychologists call it compensation. The person who felt powerless as a child seeks power as an adult. The person who was made to feel ashamed becomes relentlessly proud. The person who is never quite enough builds an empire out of the word enough, towers that bear their name, a brand that insists upon its own greatness, a persona so polished and so ferociously maintained that even its owner begins to confuse it for something real. What is real, underneath all of it, is usually something much quieter and much more tender. What is real is a wound, and the terrible ancient universal truth about wounds that are never acknowledged is that they do not heal. They simply grow more elaborate in their defenses. The mask gets thicker, the voice gets louder. The need for external validation, for cheering crowds, for loyal followers who will never question, for a mythology that confirms rather than challenges, grows more consuming with every passing year. And somewhere in the silent core of the person wearing the mask, there is always a part that knows. There is always a part that feels the exhaustion of the performance, that registers in small and quiet ways. The gap between the story being told and the truth of what is actually happening inside. This is what the ancient wisdom traditions called the shadow. Not darkness in a moral sense, but in a psychological one. The shadow is everything we have pushed away, denied, repressed, or refused to look at about ourselves. It is the fear we call strength. It is the need we call independence. It is the vulnerability we call weakness, and spend our lives armoring against. Jung taught us that the shadow does not disappear simply because we refuse to acknowledge it. It grows, it organizes, it waits, and eventually, with the patience of deep water, it rises. A person who has spent decades constructing an identity around absolute certainty, absolute dominance, and absolute refusal to admit error has built a very specific kind of prison. The bars are made of image, the locks are made of fear, and the warden, the inner critic that drives the whole performance, is convinced that to lower the guard even once, to show even a single moment of genuine vulnerability or uncertainty, would be to lose everything, would be to become, once again, that small and frightened person who is never quite enough. What we are witnessing in this public and deeply symbolic moment is the moment when that prison begins to show its cracks, not because anyone outside forced it open. Prisons of the self never open from the outside. They open, when they open at all, from within, usually through the pressure of accumulated reality, the weight of consequence, the slow and terrible recognition that the story we have been telling cannot hold any longer against the facts of the world. The terrible news is not a single piece of legislation, or a single legal case, or a single poll. The terrible news at the archetypal level is the recognition that is beginning to press in from all sides, from allies who are quietly distancing themselves, from institutions that are no longer working, from a world that is increasingly declining to organize itself around any single person's need to be seen as exceptional. The terrible news is what happens when the mirror that 1,000 devoted followers held up begins slowly to show a different reflection. In mythology, this is the moment of the great unraveling. The Greeks called it nemesis, not punishment from the gods, as it is often misunderstood, but the natural, inevitable consequence of having reached so far beyond the appropriate human scale that the very forces of balance reassert themselves. Nemesis is not cruel. It is structural. It is what happens when a system that has been pushed out of equilibrium is finally released to find its natural level again. The higher the inflation, the more dramatic the correction. This is not politics. This is physics. This is nature. This is the law that governs not just the external world, but the inner one as well. What does this have to do with you? With any of us? Why should we sit with this story when there are so many other things demanding our attention? Because the story of a public figure's fall from the heights of inflated self-perception is never just about that figure. It never has been. The myths were never about their heroes in isolation. The story of Icarus was not a story about one foolish boy with wings. It was a story about every human being who has ever confused aspiration with invincibility, who has ever felt the intoxicating warmth of early success and mistaken it for permission to abandon limits. The story of Narcissus was not a story about vanity. It was a story about what happens when a person becomes so captivated by their own reflection that they lose the ability to genuinely encounter anyone or anything outside of themselves. We watch these public stories with such intensity because something in us recognizes the pattern. Something in us knows this territory from the inside, not at the same scale, not with the same stakes, but in the private architecture of our own lives. We all know what it is to construct a mask. We all know what it is to perform a version of ourselves that feels safer, more acceptable, more powerful than the tender and uncertain truth underneath. We all know what it is to be afraid that if the performance stops, something essential will be lost. We all know the exhaustion of it. And somewhere in the deepest part of our awareness, we all know that the performance cannot last forever. This is why the fall of a public archetype carries such weight. It is not schadenfreude, or at least, it need not be. It can be something much more valuable. It can be a mirror. It can be a moment of collective recognition that invites us to look honestly and with genuine courage at the places in our own lives where we are still choosing performance over presence, where we are still choosing the safety of the mask over the risk of being truly known. Pause here for a moment and sit with that. And if this kind of deep reflection is something you want to continue exploring, if these questions feel alive and important to you, then this is a space built for that. Every video here is an attempt to find the older, deeper story beneath the noise of the moment. Stay with us if that calls to you. Now, let us talk about what actually happens, psychologically and spiritually, when a figure who has identified completely with power begins to experience the withdrawal of that power. There is a concept in depth psychology called the collapse of the persona. The persona, in Jungian terms, is the social mask, the professional self, the public role, the performed identity we present to the world. Every person has one. Every person needs one, to some degree. The persona is not inherently dishonest. It is simply the necessary costume of social life. The problem arises when the costume is mistaken for the person beneath it. The problem arises when the gap between the mask and the face becomes so wide, and the mask so rigidly maintained, that any threat to the mask is experienced as a threat to survival itself. For someone whose entire sense of self has been built upon external validation, upon winning, upon dominance, upon the unbroken projection of strength and certainty, the prospect of losing is not experienced as a normal disappointment. It is experienced as annihilation. This is why the response to setbacks, to legal challenges, to political losses, to criticism from former allies is always so disproportionate, so volcanic, so seemingly unmoored from the actual scale of what has occurred. It is because, at the level of the unconscious, the ego does not register these events as setbacks. It registers them as existential threats, as the approach of the very thing it has spent decades running from. And here is where the story becomes genuinely tragic, not in a sentimental way, but in the precise, classical sense of tragedy, the sense that the ancient dramatists understood so well. Tragedy is not merely suffering. Tragedy is the specific suffering that arises from the gap between who a person believes themselves to be and who they actually are. Tragedy is the cost of the unlived life, the authentic self that was never allowed to breathe, the vulnerability that was never permitted to speak, the grief that was never allowed to be grieved. Tragedy is what happens when the armor becomes the wound. The man at the center of this public moment, and let us remember that he stands here as an archetype as much as an individual, is carrying, as all human beings carry, a story that began long before anyone was paying attention. He carries, in the language of the body and the nervous system, the marks of an interior world that had to learn very early to equate softness with danger, to equate uncertainty with failure, to equate the natural human experience of not knowing with an intolerable vulnerability that could never be shown. These are not excuses. These are not justifications for harm caused to others. They are simply the psychological reality of what it looks like when a wound goes unacknowledged for long enough. It becomes a worldview. It becomes a leadership style. It becomes a way of moving through the world that, at scale, has consequences far beyond the individual psyche. The terrible news, in this deepest sense, is not something that happened to one person. The terrible news is what has been happening slowly and then all at once, as the consequences of an unexamined inner life collide with the irreducible reality of the outer world. The terrible news is the bill arriving, not as punishment, but as information, as the universe's patient, impersonal, utterly non-negotiable response to the distance between the story told and the truth that was always there. And what does that response look like? It looks like institutions that were bent beginning to reassert their original shape. It looks like allies whose loyalty was built on fear rather than genuine connection beginning to make quieter calculations. It looks like the audiences that once filled stadiums with a kind of desperate, searching energy beginning to thin. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with the slow and irreversible quality of a tide that is turned. It looks like legal systems and financial systems and geopolitical systems all beginning to register, in their own impersonal languages, the accumulated cost of decisions made from the compressed, defended, fearful interior of a wound that was never made. None of this is simple. None of this is satisfying in the way that simple stories of triumph and defeat are satisfying. Real human stories, the ones worth sitting with, the ones that carry genuine wisdom, are almost never simple. They are layered. They are uncomfortable. They require us to hold multiple truths at once. That a person can cause genuine harm and also be genuinely suffering. That a system can fail and also be attempting to correct. That the fall of a powerful figure can be both necessary and tragic. That we can recognize patterns of behavior we find harmful without reducing a human being to those patterns. That justice and compassion are not opposites, but at the deepest level partners. The ancient wisdom traditions were not squeamish about this complexity. The great myths never offered clean villains or uncomplicated heroes. Achilles was the greatest warrior of his age, and also a man consumed by ego and grief who chose personal glory over the lives of his companions. Oedipus was a king of genuine intelligence and care who was also, at the same time, the unknowing source of the very plague he was trying to heal. Caesar was both the liberator of the people and the man who made himself so indispensable to the story of Rome that his removal, when it finally came, was catastrophic for the very institutions he claimed to embody. These stories endure not because they offer simple moral lessons, but because they hold, with extraordinary precision, the full weight of human contradiction. What we are watching now, in the unfolding of this very modern myth, is that same ancient pattern playing out in real time, with all of its complexity and all of its cost. And if we are willing to look at it clearly, not through the lens of partisan satisfaction or partisan grief, but through the older, quieter lens of what it means to be human, we will find in it something genuinely valuable. We will find a mirror, because here is what the fall of the inflated ego always teaches when we are willing to receive the teaching. The fall is not the end of the story. In the deepest mythological and psychological sense, the fall is the beginning. It is the necessary precondition for what the alchemists called the nigredo, the darkening, the dissolution, the breaking down of the old form that must precede the emergence of anything genuinely new. Every story of genuine transformation, from the oldest shamanic traditions to the most contemporary psychological frameworks, passes through exactly this territory. The hero must descend, the mask must fail, the armor must crack. The story that was never entirely true must finally release its grip on the narrator. What comes after that release is never predetermined. It is never guaranteed. The descent into the nigredo does not automatically produce transformation. Some people emerge from the dissolution into something genuinely new and more authentic. Others simply rebuild the same armor, tighter and more defended than before. Others become so identified with the fall itself, so consumed by the wound of public humiliation or legal consequence or political defeat, that they spend what remains of their energy in rage and grievance, never quite finding the still point where genuine reflection might become possible. Which path is taken depends entirely on something that no external force can provide, and no external pressure can compel. It depends on willingness, on the specific, interior, deeply personal willingness to look honestly at the face behind the mask, not with self-laceration, not with the punishing voice of judgment, but with the kind of clear-eyed, steady, compassionate witnessing that all genuine self-knowledge requires. It is, in the end, the only work that matters. It is the work that all the great traditions, beneath their different languages and different cosmologies, are ultimately pointing toward. We cannot do that work for anyone else. We can witness the need for it. We can create the conditions that make it more possible or less possible. But the moment of genuine interior reckoning, when it comes, is always solitary. Always between the person and the truth of what they have been. Always, ultimately, a conversation that happens in the silence below all the noise. What we can do as witnesses is resist the temptation to flatten this story into something simpler than it is. We can resist the urge to make it a story of pure victory or pure defeat, of heroes and villains, of the righteous prevailing and the wicked falling. We can allow it to be what it actually is. A deeply human story about the consequences of living too far from one's own truth for too long, under too much pressure, with too little genuine support for the interior life that all human beings, regardless of their power or fame or fortune, need in order to remain connected to something real. And we can ask ourselves, quietly and without judgment, where in our own lives we are doing something similar, where we are performing rather than inhabiting, where we are defending rather than opening, where we are choosing the safety of the mask over the risk of genuine contact, not because our stakes are the same. They almost certainly are not. but because the pattern itself is universal. Because the wound that drives us to perform rather than be present does not distinguish between the powerful and the powerless. It lives in all of us, in its own particular shape, waiting patiently for the moment we are willing to see it clearly. This is the invitation that sits at the heart of every great mythological fall. Not the invitation to judge, not the invitation to celebrate, the invitation to recognize, to look at the ancient pattern playing out in modern clothes and say, quietly, yes, I know this territory, not from the outside, but from the inside. I know what it is to defend a wound instead of healing it. I know what it is to build an identity out of what I am not rather than what I am. I know what it is to run from the very thing I need most to face. And knowing that, sitting with that recognition, allowing it to be real, is the beginning of something. Not the beginning of superiority, not the beginning of having figured it all out, but the beginning of genuine humility, the beginning of the kind of self-awareness that does not inflate or deflate, but simply sees, the beginning of the inner work that does not end with any single insight, but continues quietly and consistently across the whole of a life. Let us stay with that for a moment before we move into the final part of this reflection, because it is the most important thing that has been said so far, and it deserves its space. You are not above this pattern because you can see it in another person. The recognition itself, if it is honest, should make you more humble, not less. The moment we watch a public figure unravel and feel only satisfaction, only vindication, only the clean comfort of having been right about someone else's wrongness, we have missed the deepest lesson this story is offering. We have turned a mirror into a window and looked through it at someone else's flaw instead of our own. The mirror is always more useful. The mirror is always what the ancient stories intended. This is the quiet center of what is unfolding in the news cycle right now. Not the legal specifics, not the political calculations, not the strategic maneuvering of factions and institutions. Beneath all of that, at the level where the oldest stories live, the center of this moment is a question that belongs to all of us, not just to the figure at the center of the storm. The question is this: what happens when a way of being in the world that has always relied on the suppression of truth, personal truth, interior truth, the quiet truth of the life that wants to be genuinely lived, is finally confronted with consequences too large and too structural to suppress or spin or outlast? What happens is exactly what we are watching. The consequences do not negotiate. They do not respond to the tools that worked against smaller obstacles. They do not yield to force of personality or volume of insistence. They simply are, and in their implacable and personal presence they reveal, for anyone willing to look, the shape of everything that was ignored in order to arrive here. This is what the terrible news actually is. Not a legal document, not a poll number, not an alliance fractured or a narrative damaged. The terrible news, at its deepest level, is the confrontation with reality that was always coming. The territory that could not be indefinitely avoided. The reckoning that arrives in one form or another for every human being who has chosen, across the years, the performance over the presence. The terrible news is not extraordinary. The terrible news is, in fact, the most ordinary thing in the world. It is the bill that life sends, with absolute consistency, when the work of knowing oneself has been deferred too long. And perhaps there is, in that very ordinariness, a strange kind of relief. Not relief at someone's suffering. That would be too small a response to too large a story, but relief at the recognition that reality is still real, that consequences still follow from choices, that no amount of noise or spectacle or carefully maintained mythology can permanently substitute for the quiet, foundational work of being honest with oneself and responsible toward others, that the universe, in whatever language you prefer to speak in, psychological or spiritual or simply structural, is still organized around truth at its core. That the distance between performance and reality cannot be indefinitely maintained. That the mask, however thick, however polished, however long and successfully worn, is still only a mask. There is something profoundly stabilizing about that recognition. Not because it makes everything simple, not because it resolves the genuine complexity of what is happening or what comes next, but because it reminds us that we are living inside a story that is governed by something older and deeper than any single chapter of it. We are living inside the ancient, patient, endlessly recurring story of what it means to be human, with all the potential and all the limitation and all the extraordinary capacity for both self-deception and genuine awakening that humanity has always carried. The great traditions speak of this moment of confrontation with accumulated truth, not as a catastrophe, but as a threshold, as the entrance to a passage that is difficult and sometimes terrifying, but ultimately leads somewhere more real than the territory that came before. The Sufis called it the annihilation of the false self, phantom, and they spoke of it not as loss, but as liberation. The Buddhist traditions speak of the dissolution of the constructed self as the very condition that makes genuine presence possible. The Christian mystics called it the dark night of the soul, not the darkness of evil, but the darkness of a sky before dawn, when all the comfortable illusions have been stripped away, and what remains is something bare and vulnerable, and for the first time in perhaps a very long time, genuinely open. We do not know from the outside whether the figure at the center of this public moment will find that threshold. We cannot know from our position as observers whether what appears to be a fall is also, in the interior space that none of us can see, the beginning of something more honest. We do not know, and it is not ours to judge. What we can know, what we can hold with care and attention, is that the possibility always exists, not as a guarantee, not as a certainty, but as the irreducible fact of human potential, which does not expire at any age, or any level of prior damage, or any degree of prior harm caused. The potential for a genuine turn toward truth, toward the quiet, difficult, unspectacular work of knowing oneself and accepting the full weight of what one is and has done. That potential is never extinguished. This is not a sentimental claim. It is the most consistent teaching of every wisdom tradition that has ever asked this question seriously. And it is paradoxically the most hopeful thing that can be said about even the most deeply defended and apparently unreachable human interior. The door is always there, not always open, not always easy to find, but always there, as we near the end of this reflection. And before we offer the final insight that we want you to carry with you, let us acknowledge something quietly and without fanfare. If you have stayed with this for this long, if something in this conversation felt worth your time, then you are someone who takes these questions seriously. You are someone who is willing to sit with complexity, with discomfort, with the kind of ambiguity that does not resolve neatly and does not offer easy satisfaction. That willingness is not common. It is, in fact, one of the most important qualities a human being can cultivate. It is the foundation of genuine wisdom, not the wisdom of answers, but the wisdom of the right questions held with patience and care. If that is the kind of exploration you want to continue, then this is where it lives. This is a space for exactly this kind of thinking, and it would be a genuine pleasure to have you as part of it. Now, the final insight, at the very center of everything we have been exploring, beneath the mythology, beneath the psychology, beneath the particular drama of this particular moment in history, there is a single, quiet truth that the oldest traditions have been trying to communicate in every language and through every story they have ever told. It is a truth that is easy to state and genuinely difficult to inhabit. It is this: every human being, without exception, is both the story and the one watching the story. both the mask and the face beneath it, both the wound and the capacity to heal it, both the person who chose performance over presence for all those years and the awareness that can now, in this very moment, see that choice clearly and choose differently. The terrible news that the world is full of the collapse of icons, the fall of the powerful, the unraveling of carefully constructed narratives is only terrible from within the story, from the position of the one watching, from the position of the awareness that can see the pattern without being consumed by it. The very same events carry a different meaning. They are not terrible. They are instructive. They are the world's patient, impersonal, endlessly recurring reminder that nothing built on a false foundation can stand indefinitely. That power, without genuine self-knowledge, is always, ultimately, a structure waiting for the right pressure to reveal its true nature. That the most important work any human being can do, more important than any external achievement, more foundational than any public role, is the interior work of knowing oneself with honesty, with humility, and with the quiet, steady courage that genuine self-examination always requires. This work does not make you special. It does not elevate you above others or place you in some select category of the awakened. It simply makes you more honestly yourself, more present, more capable of genuine contact with other people and with the reality of the world as it actually is rather than as you need it to be, more available, in the quiet and unpretentious way, to the life that is actually yours rather than the performance of a life you thought would protect you from something. That is the invitation this moment carries, not the invitation to judge the powerful, not the invitation to celebrate the fall of someone you disagree with, not the invitation to construct a more sophisticated narrative about who is right and who is wrong and what it all means for the future of democracy or civilization or anything else. The invitation is much smaller and much more profound than any of those. The invitation is simply to look honestly at the pattern, to recognize it gently and without self-punishment, wherever it lives in your own interior, and then, not dramatically, not with fanfare or declaration, but simply quietly, in the ordinary texture of your daily life, to choose, one moment at a time, a little more presence over performance, a little more honesty over image, a little more genuine contact with what is real over the comfortable maintenance of a story that keeps you safe, but keeps you small. That is the whole teaching. That has always been the whole teaching. Everything else, every myth, every archetype, every dramatic story of rise and fall and consequence and reckoning is just the ancient way of wrapping that single truth in forms the human heart can receive. The news cycle will continue. There will be more headlines, more revelations, more moments that feel like they carry the full weight of historical significance. And each of those moments will offer, for those who are paying a particular kind of attention, the same invitation this one offers. The invitation to see the pattern, to learn from it, to allow the outer story to illuminate the inner one, and to carry that illumination not as superiority, not as certainty, not as the proof of anything about yourself relative to others, but simply as a more honest and more humble relationship with your own truth. You are not chosen, neither is anyone else, but you are, like every human being who has ever lived, capable of the one thing that matters more than being chosen. You are capable of choosing presence, choosing honesty, choosing the quiet, unspectacular, endlessly demanding work of being genuinely, responsibly, humbly yourself. That is enough. It has always been enough. It will always be enough.